Afternoon, everyone. With the permission of the chairperson, I would start my oration now. Thank you, Dr. Jaladhar Rawat and the UP UK State Chapter Executive Committee for providing me this opportunity. We have heard several talks related to antenatal diagnosis, fetal therapy, but this subject is quite close to my heart and I'm very passionate about, so I just chose this as my oration topic. And we are all aware that between 3 and 6% of babies are born with congenital abnormalities, but globally, it is seen that 20% of neonatal deaths are attributable to congenital malformations. So, and we know that CNS anomalies are the commonest, followed by other system anomalies like genitourinary, gastrointestinal. And 80% of these congenital anomalies babies are terminated even before being referred to a pediatric surgeon or for any antenatal counseling by the obstetricians. And amongst these, it's very unfortunate that even the minor ones, which are otherwise totally compatible with life and have good outcome, postnatal outcome, are also terminated due to ignorance and inadequate counseling. For screening for these anomalies, we've heard that time-tested ultrasound, which is very widely available and cost-effective, is the first screening modality. It's a very safe tool during pregnancy, and it is available. But having said that, there are limitations to diagnosis, not even dependent on the machine available, but the expertise of the ultrasonologist. And other than that, in very obese women, or if the Leica is inadequate, then sometimes there are limitations to correct diagnosis. Ultrasound screening has now been even extended to the first trimester. Traditionally, it was done during the second trimester as an anomaly scan, but more and more literature is coming for use of screening ultrasound around 12 weeks in the first trimester, which is mainly done for determination of gestational age, viable fetus, and for testing for aneuploidy, actually. So during the first trimester scan, measurement of nuchal translucency is very important, as more than 50% of major structural anomalies can be detected during this first trimester scan, and these anomalies are mostly lethal. And if that is suspected, because nuchal translucency, if it is more than 3.5 mm, it is supposed to be increased, and it is a very strong marker for aneuploidy. And once that has been ruled out, then these fetuses should definitely be looked for other major structural abnormalities, and hence this is a pointer that the second trimester anomaly scan should be a detailed scan, and one should look out for presence of any congenital abnormalities. Second trimester scan, as I said, is the gold standard for anatomic evaluation of the fetus, and majority of anomalies can be detected on the scan. We know that major malformations are more easily detectable than the minor ones. In this second trimester scan, there are certain soft markers which should be looked for, as mentioned, increased nuchal fold, hypoplastic or absent nasal bone. This is a very strong marker for trisomy 21. And aberrant right subclavian artery, echogenic bowel, or short long bones. These are high-risk aneuploidy markers, whereas sometimes we get referrals with reports of a choroid plexus cyst or an isolated intracardiac echogenic focus. These are low-risk markers for aneuploidy, but do warrant testing for any chromosomal abnormalities. So now there is enough published data regarding what are these isolated sonographic markers used for, and amongst these, absent or hypoplastic nasal bone is the strongest marker for trisomy 21. Also, why do we recommend screening in all pregnant women? Because it has been seen that 75% of anomalies occur in low-risk women. So, all the pregnancies should be screened by ultrasound to rule out congenital abnormalities. But then we have seen that there can be discrepancies between antenatal and postnatal diagnosis, and it has been reported very widely, and also sometimes misdiagnosis. We know that majority of our esophageal atresia with tracheal fistula babies, they are detected at the time of birth, although they've undergone multiple, sometimes 2 or more antenatal ultrasounds. And then this has also been seen for diaphragmatic hernias and very occasionally even for abdominal wall defects. So, but then of late, recent advances in ultrasound technology is minimizing these misdiagnoses, because now we have high resolution ultrasound imaging by 3D and 4D technology. And these, usually the 2D ultrasound is enough to diagnose majority of malformations, but conditions like micrognathia, orofacial clefts, and limb abnormalities like talipes and all, they are picked up better on a 3D ultrasound. So, and with this advanced technology, there is improved detection of congenital heart defects also, major structural heart defects, and neural tube defects and other malformations. Other than ultrasound, we have now more use of fetal MRI. MRI has become more useful now because of its wider availability and high resolution imaging. More complex malformations can be detected by MRI, and it is considered to be safe in pregnancy, and no harmful fetal effects have been reported. So MRI imaging, as we see, you can see the severe bilateral cerebral ventriculomegaly. Sometimes ultrasound imaging may not be that easily interpretable by us, but then as pediatric surgeons, these MRI images sometimes become more easy to see and show the parents also. This is a baby with fetus with congenital diaphragmatic hernia. So earlier, the limitation with MRI was that fetal movements would create artifacts, but nowadays, in the recent times, with ultra-fast techniques and rapid sequence imaging, there are decreased artifacts, and even maternal sedation is not given during MRI. Visualization is also less limited in MRI because of maternal body habitus, because in obese women sometimes ultrasound may not give us very good imaging quality, but then MRI has advantage. And also fetal position sometimes becomes a disadvantage in ultrasound, and which is possible, whatever fetus position may be there, MRI is doable. And even in oligohydramnios, MRI is useful, is preferred. So MRI usually allows for 3-dimensional reconstruction of imaging. So it is better used for fetal lung volume measurements, and also in cases where some fetal surgery is being planned, then preoperative planning is done better by a fetal MRI. So most of the fetal medicine centers which are doing fetal interventions, they use fetal MRI before doing any intervention. The only concern, which is I think a very important concern, is the cost, the access to equipment, and there is lack of trained personnel to acquire and interpret images, whereas ultrasound is very widely and easily accessible and low cost modality. Other than these imaging by ultrasound and MRI, we have biochemical marker screening, quadruple screen, amniocentesis and chorionic villus biopsy, and this non-invasive prenatal testing, which tests the cell-free fetal DNA, is coming up, emerging as a very important modality. This is a test done with maternal serum, blood sample, and it is being used in oncology, also known as liquid biopsy. So same thing, it is being done in antenatal testing, and usually it is done after 15 weeks, and once by the first trimester scan, the pregnancy has been confirmed, and there is any marker towards suspecting any aneuploidy or chromosomal abnormality, then this NIPT is offered to the mother, and this is coming up as a very important test. Amongst molecular diagnostics, chromosomal microarray analysis and next generation sequencing, these are emerging as very important modalities for genetic testing of any chromosomal abnormality. So next generation sequencing is just a targeted panel of genetic testing instead of doing whole exome or whole genome sequencing, and it is being widely used in genetic abnormalities. Fetal echo is not done routinely, not advised routinely in all cases with antenatal abnormalities, but in select group. where there is increased nuchal translucency, or there is early onset fetal growth restriction, or if there is abnormal biochemical screening. Single umbilical artery is one of the conditions where fetal echo should be advised. Or if there is some family history of congenital heart disease or other major structural abnormalities are detected, then fetal echo should be advised along with NIPT testing. So in the next few slides, I'll just discuss about some common conditions which you come across. And congenital diaphragmatic hernia is easily picked up. And whenever these bowel loops are seen in the heart, in the thorax, then this is suspected. And usually when it is suspected, the ultrasonologist or the fetal medicine specialist would tell us about an important ratio, which is the lung-head ratio, which is an important prognostic marker. And as pediatric surgeons, we are all aware of this, that how is it measured. We take the volume of the contralateral lung is measured in the 4-chamber view of heart, and that is proportionated to the biparietal view. The head circumference is calculated in the biparietal view, and the ratio is taken. So this lung-head ratio is dependent on the gestational age, and so it has been seen that the ratio of there are normograms of lung-head ratio according to the gestational age. So what should be there at particular gestation, and usually they calculate it as observed to expected lung-head ratio, and that is a pointer to the degree of pulmonary hypoplasia, because that is an important prognostic marker in diaphragmatic hernias. Then the other thing which is seen is the position of the liver, whether liver is up in the thorax or it is down. And the third thing which they report to us is the position of the stomach in the left diaphragmatic hernia, whether it is in the, and that is also graded from grade 1 to grade 4, with grade 1 being stomach not being in the chest, and grade 4 being that the entire stomach is in the chest. So once this is reported, we have to look for other associated abnormalities, and whereas the cardiac and cardiovascular malformations may be present in 1/3 of cases of diaphragmatic hernias, and that should be ruled out. So it has been seen that observed to expected lung-head ratio is an independent predictor of postnatal survival in all babies of the congenital diaphragmatic hernias. And there is also recently published data showing that survival depends both on the presence of liver being up or down along with the observed expected lung-head ratio. So when the observed to expected lung-head ratio is more than 45%, then the degree of pulmonary hypoplasia is mild, and survival is supposed to be tune of 85%. And other than that, the severity of pulmonary hypertension is another thing, but this cannot be assessed antenatally, and that is a limitation where we are still struggling to know why some neonates, despite having mild to moderate pulmonary hyperplasia, do not make it have poor survival. So probably pulmonary hypertension plays an important contribution to our neonatal outcome. It has been seen that prediction in the right congenital diaphragmatic hernia still remains a challenge antenatally, and usually the diagnosis is also not as common as compared to the left side. So there is level 1 evidence that isolated left congenital diaphragmatic hernia is amenable, select cases are amenable to fetal intervention in the form of FETO procedure, which is ultrasound guided fetal endoscopic occlusion procedure. But that is true in very select cases, and it has been reported as the outcome of the total trial. But then still it is, I would say, experimental, because there is increased risk of premature rupture of membranes has been reported, leading to prematurity, and prematurity has its other inherent risks. So the second condition which we commonly see is congenital abnormalities of kidney and urinary tract, which is the most commonly reported antenatal abnormality, and hydronephrosis amongst them is the most common. And we know that once it is reported, then we should try and look for other associated anomalies. Along with hydronephrosis, we should look for renal parenchymal echogenicity, how is the bladder, whether this is unilateral or bilateral, and how much is the amniotic fluid volume. So all these things should be looked at when we get a report of antenatal hydronephrosis. So antenatal pelvic calyceal dilatation is often reported in second trimester scans. So we did a study in our institute. This was a prospective study of significance of third trimester ultrasound in detecting the congenital abnormalities of kidney and urinary tract. And what our results showed was 60% cases of hydronephrosis, which were detected in the second trimester, they resolved in utero. So, and amongst those which persisted in the third trimester, if the renal pelvic diameter was less than 10 mm, then the possibility of postnatal congenital abnormalities of kidney Charcot was only 23%. Whereas if the renal pelvic diameter was more than 10 mm in third trimester scan, then the possibility of postnatal Charcot was up to 86%. This was what we found in our prospective study. So these are very common findings which we see, the renal pelvic calyceal dilatation, and then in those cases we have to see the amniotic fluid volume. This is another antenatal image of an enlarged bladder and a keyhole sign, and in this particular case there was oligohydramnios as well. So this is a case in which there was suspected, it was gross unilateral hydronephrosis only. There was no ureteric dilatation reported. The amniotic fluid volume was normal. So this was suspected pelvic-ureteric junction. The immediate postnatal scan also showed gross pelvic calyceal dilatation. And this particular neonate underwent an early surgery for PUJ obstruction. So this was another neonate we got this year, early this year, which he had a report of bilateral UTD A to A3 and had a gross hydroureteronephrosis and a distended bladder, but the liquor was, amniotic fluid was normal. Postnatally, since we didn't know the sex, this was a male child, but postnatally baby had good urinary stream, so posterior urethra was ruled out, posturethral valves were ruled out. So postnatally this baby had bilateral hydroureteronephrosis and then later was diagnosed to have grade 5 VUR on one side and grade 3 on the other side. So this is another baby with a lower urinary tract obstruction and a classical keyhole sign, but with a normal liquor. And the postnatal scan confirmed, ultrasound scan confirmed posturethral valves, and this baby underwent valve fulguration. So we all are aware of with this prenatal classification and postnatal, when there is a UTD classification which describes, classifies into low risk and increased risk. So if there is only pelvic calyceal dilatation there, but then if it is associated with other abnormalities like reduced parenchymal thickness or bladder and ureter abnormalities, then they are increased risk. So accordingly, we can counsel these parents for postnatally what to expect. This particular case, we had this diagnosis was made at 13 weeks. This was a mother with IVF conception, and at 13 weeks gestation, we found megacystis and an umbilical cord cyst. So the mother was counseled, they wanted to continue with pregnancy since it was just a 13-week scan. NIPT revealed low risk, there was no aneuploidy, fetal echo was normal. So as the pregnancy progressed between 22 to 24 weeks, we could see a pelvic structure with a septum. But as we could not reveal the sex of the baby, we knew that there was something like a urogenital sinus. So we said there could be some pelvic cystic mass. The parents still wanted to continue. Then at 33 weeks gestation, it was sure that there was a persistent urogenital sinus with bilateral hydroureteronephrosis causing obstruction as well. Then the postnatal scan, this was a female baby and had a urogenital sinus and required, there was urethral outlet obstruction. So immediately that was relieved, the hydroureteronephrosis resolved. So this baby is having now a normal urethra, is now 6 months old. No major surgical procedure has been done because the lower urinary tract obstruction has resolved, but then, and the hydrometrocolpos also has resolved. And this baby is just having a urogenital sinus and is awaiting repair for that. So lower urinary tract obstruction antenatally has been classified into 4 stages according to the amniotic fluid volume and other things, ultrasound findings from stage 1 to stage 4. Stage 1 is the one which has most favorable, and it is the stage 2 is the one in which the fetal intervention is usually advised, like by psychoamniotic shunting or other shunt procedures. So fetal interventions for lower urinary tract obstruction has been advised, and we heard that in the. But as of now, I don't know whether it is really improving the long-term outcome of these babies, renal outcome and long-term outcome. So the third condition we'll talk about is congenital lung lesions, in which antenatal diagnosis is made routinely in the second trimester scans, and serial monitoring for size of lesion is recommended. Whenever we see there is a increase or decrease echogenicity, or there's a mass causing mediastinal shift, or there is lung compression, then it is suspected. And Doppler ultrasound is usually recommended only when we are suspecting a bronchopulmonary sequestration to identify the feeding vessels. So we have had some early diagnosis for these echogenic lung lesions, and in which, when counseled, the parents have opted to continue with the pregnancy, whereas on other, sometimes even with smaller lesions and timely diagnosed, parents have opted for termination. So in this particular case, we continued at 20 and 23 weeks. The volume of the lesion was increasing, but the CVR was less than 1. And since that was less than 1, the parents continued. And this baby had no hydrops, so a term delivery was done. And this was at postnatally, we found that there was no mediastinal shift, and baby was asymptomatic at birth. So in congenital lung lesions, whenever they are diagnosed antenatally, the prognostic indicator is a CPAM volume to head circumference ratio, which is known as CVR. And it's a very important marker which our fetal medicine specialists usually calculate for us and tell us. And it is well established that when it is less than 0.9 or less than 1, so more than 90% of these neonates will at the time of birth will be asymptomatic, and later on, depending on how they become symptomatic, the condition can be managed. So whenever the CVR is more than 1.7, these are the high-risk neonates, and in those cases, when timely diagnosed, termination can be advised. And it can be discussed, the option can be given to the parents. Nowadays, MRI is being used more often to identify these lung parenchymal abnormalities and for assessment of the fetal lung volume. Besides CPAM, there are ultrasound also diagnoses conditions like foregut duplication cyst and congenital cystic adenoid malformations. And then sometimes to diagnose the feeding vessels, ultrasound Doppler is routinely used. This is a baby in whom fetal MRI was done at 28 weeks to confirm CPAM. Then antenatal ultrasound in a 23-week fetus with this cystic abnormality, which was congenital lobar emphysema later on. Antenatally, it is very difficult to differentiate between various different CPAMs. This was another case which we had, which was a subdiaphragmatic extralobar pulmonary sequestration. Since it was a subdiaphragmatic lesion and parents were counseled and they continued with pregnancy, and postnatally, on the first immediate postnatal ultrasound, that lesion was clearly identified separate from the left adrenal gland. It was a supraadrenal echogenic mass having a systemic blood supply. But to our surprise, at 6 weeks, when the parents came for the subsequent ultrasound scan, our ultrasonologist, who had done all the previous scans, could not identify any echogenic lesion in that particular area, and whereas the left adrenal gland was easily clearly seen. So as of now, we assume that probably that has resolved completely, but we may further continue since baby is asymptomatic and ultrasound is not showing any persisting lesion. So we are just observing this baby. So nowadays, there are well-published CVR-based guidelines for management of fetal lung malformations. And I think as pediatric surgeons, we are all aware of this. And we can risk stratify our babies and do accordingly do antenatal counseling. There is there's only level 3 evidence for any kind of fetal intervention for CPAMs, and this is being only done as experimental cases in select fetal centers. So the natural history of prenatally diagnosed congenital pulmonary airway malformations has been published by various European centers. This is a recently published study from Sweden in which, and I think this a similar experience has been with all of us as well, that majority of these show prenatal regression, and it is not uncommon. Prenatal regression of CPAMs is not uncommon. And in this particular series, they said that 69% could be managed conservatively during 4-year follow-up. So still the jury is out whether all of them all these CPAMs who are asymptomatic should be operated electively, or those who regress completely, what should be done for them. So other conditions which we are diagnosed are like duodenal atresia. Classically, double bubble is seen on an ultrasound. But most of these babies are referred to us in early 3rd trimester or around 30 to 32 weeks. So rarely do they come in the 2nd trimester. So whenever they are diagnosed on 2nd trimester scan, it's important that we rule out other congenital cardiac anomalies, do an aneuploidy, rule out chromosomal abnormalities. So amniotic fluid index measurement is something which is also done by the fetal medical specialist to tell us about polyhydramnios, because that can also be an important reason for mothers undergoing preterm delivery, or a lot of these babies with atresia. More and more babies come to antenatal counselings are received for multiple distended bowel loops. So nowadays, with more expertise, even intestinal atresias are being diagnosed antenatally. And this particular baby had very dilated small bowel loops and had a jejunal atresia. And even antenatally, meconium cysts are sometimes diagnosed. And since these are usually 3rd trimester diagnoses, so whatever is done is usually postnatal management. But antenatal counseling does help parents to prepare better for the postnatal outcome. So this particular baby came to us had an antenatal diagnosis of fetal ascites outside in the 3rd trimester. This baby was delivered outside. They came to us postnatally at 5 weeks. So it was continued with a diagnosis of fetal ascites and aneuploidy and whole exome sequencing, and everything was done. That was all negative. But when we did an ultrasound at our center, we felt this was not ascites, but this was a multiseptated cyst. So this particular baby then was advised surgery because there was failure to gain weight. And what we found was a massive chylolymphatic omental cyst. And this baby postnatally had an uneventful recovery. So certain fetal ultrasounds in 3rd trimester can show us cystic lesion with a bowel wall signature. So this was probably suggestive of an intestinal duplication cyst. This baby was asymptomatic, was being followed up by postnatal scan, and will be operated later on. So this is another case which came to us for the fetal MRI was done at our center, and which showed a multiseptated cystic lesion which was 8 by 4.8 centimeter. And to our surprise, postnatal 2 months, at the age of 2 months, when the ultrasound was done, since the baby was asymptomatic and was delivered outside, they came to us at 2 months age. And when this ultrasound was done at 2 months, there was no intra-abdominal cystic lesion identified, and what the ultrasonologist reported was just a small facial defect at the umbilical region, a small umbilical hernia. So even this cyst probably resolved antenatally. So this is another case which we had, which was a dichorionic diamniotic gestation. This was an IVF pregnancy. This was one of Dr. Agarwal's patient with one twin with huge sacrococcygeal teratoma at 31 weeks antenatal scan. And this baby, this was IVF conception. They were delivered in our center, and postnatally, this baby was uneventfully operated and had an uneventful recovery. So we know that antenatally detected abdominal cysts, they can arise from anywhere in the gastrointestinal tract or the genitourinary tract, and the commonest are ovarian cysts, and many of them can regress during pregnancy or even postnatally. So 1/3 of these show spontaneous antenatal resolution. This has been well reported in several series. The size of the cyst, especially for ovarian cysts, it is said that if antenatally they are less than 5 centimeter, 76% of them show a spontaneous resolution. It is also seen that reported that small cysts, which are intraparenchymal or unilocular, they are most likely to resolve spontaneously, and hence we can counsel the parents accordingly. And antenatal cyst size is predictive of postnatal persistence, but not for the need for surgery, was what this particular S. Lewis et al. Reported in their series published in 2022. This is another case of an antenatal ultrasound which showed a biliary cystic malformation. These are very rare conditions. And this is another one in which there was a subhepatic cyst on MRI. Another very rare finding of a duplicated gallbladder. So antenatally detected liver and biliary pathologies are rare, and they do not require any immediate postnatal intervention. So most of them need to be confirmed postnatally, and then depending on the postnatal findings, appropriate treatment is given. But sometimes we do get referral for fetal hepatic calcifications. So fetal hepatic calcifications, if we find, then we need to advise NIPT testing to rule out any chromosomal abnormalities. So antenatally detected lymphangiomas, these are also seen very commonly. We had one, and for these antenatal 3D ultrasound scans give a better image, better picture, a clearer picture, so that in a lot of these cases, exit can be planned, and it is being done in many centers. This particular baby did not have any distress at the time of birth, so underwent surgery at 10 weeks age and had a uneventually recovery. Abdominal wall defects, cleft lip and palate, neural tube defects. So these are many of these conditions which we face and which we come to us for antenatal counseling. So finally, in the last few slides, I would talk about why do we need. So it is we needed to provide information to the parents for the fetal outcome. We have to help them regarding what are the possible interventions, what should be done antenatally and postnatally, and what should they expect for long-term outcome. So it helps them understand the pathophysiology and the natural history better, as we have shown that many of them can resolve and not all of them require surgery. So delivery planning can be done at a tertiary care center, and most of these cases do not require a cesarean section. That is what we need to emphasize. On only very rare cases where we suspect that there can be some concern for dystocia or bleeding or disruption at the time of delivery, then only, or cesarean should be advisable, and otherwise plan for exit in appropriate cases. So who should be doing the counseling? It should be done by a multidisciplinary team. The maternal fetal medicine specialist is making the diagnosis. Obstetrician and neonatologist, they suggest the optimal mode and peri-delivery management. Pediatric surgeon will present the options for the surgical correction, and together the team will tell them about the outcome. So our counseling should always include a detailed description of the natural history, associated conditions, and then all the perinatal concerns, the time, place, and mode of delivery, the postnatal outcome, the long-term follow-up, the quality of life, and if there is termination of pregnancy option is there. So we know that pediatric surgeon's role is vital. It has been shown that if the neonate survives the first any baby with major structural abnormalities is surviving the first 4 weeks of life, then the long-term outcome, 10-year survival, is more than 95%. And this was reported in multi-center registry in Europe and from 13 European countries. recently, I think this was also mentioned in the talk in morning session, and this is a review article, I think, which most of us would have already gone through, so I will not uh, talk in detail, but this is a very good attempt by our IAPS executive and along with Dr. Prabodh Goyal to classify and provide a framework to assist in doing antenatal counseling. But having said that, we know that it has always got to be a personalized approach, because counseling depends not only on the anomaly but on the family history, on the parental concerns. And it is okay to convey uncertainty that we don't know. So, as clinicians, it is not wrong to say that what would be the outcome, we are also not sure. When we say that 90% outcome is good, we don't know that their baby is in the 90% or 10%. So, for them, it is 50-50. So, and the counseling should always be non directive. We should not try to influence their decision making. And we should understand there's a lot of anxiety and trauma. So, it has not to be one time counseling, it has to be repeated counseling. And in today's era, there is a lot of legal and ethical obligation for a clinician. So we need to be very conscious and aware about things like wrongful birth and wrongful life litigations, because they are as of now not prevalent in India, but in the near future we don't know that our own babies who are born today, when they become adults, they can claim, bring upon that claim on pediatric surgeons for a wrongful life, because these things are prevalent in international literature. When I did my PGD MLE and did this literature search for this, so in international law, both in UK, US, and Europe, these claims of wrongful birth and wrongful life are prevalent, and claim is being awarded. So, what can save us is proper counseling, detailed documentation of our counseling that we have said, and it's not wrong to say that we are not sure. It is up to the parents to want what they want. If their decision is to terminate, they should go ahead and do it. So, ethics in counseling in perinatology is very important. We have to, it's not only the right of the unborn, it is also the mother has a right to decide what she wants for herself. And so a lot of parents decide not to have a malformed baby because they are not ready to take care of any baby with morbidity. Whereas there are certain parents who are okay with having a baby, and because their cultural or religious beliefs does not allow termination. So there are a lot of concerns. Even financial concern is also a very important thing. So standardization of care is important, because neonatal outcome is very variable. We all know there are centers reporting neonatal survival mortality to the tune of only 5 to 7%, and whereas there, on the other hand, there is up to 30% mortality, neonatal mortality. So standardization of care is very important so that we can improve our overall postnatal neonatal outcome. So to conclude, antenatal counseling for surgical malformations has improved significantly. There's a lot of effort to standardize these things, and this has allowed better pregnancy management and postnatal care, and multidisciplinary approach is definitely going to help in providing optimal postnatal outcome. Thank you.